So now I would like to request the President of Cooch Behar Archive, Mr. Rzishikalpa Paul, to give his lecture, whose brainchild is our organization that was founded in 2013. Though he is a student of botany, he takes interest in different fields, one of which is the local history of Cooch Behar and northeastern India. He has been researching the history of this region for many years now, and notably, his findings have contributed in many renowned national and international journals. Mr. Paul.
Namaskar, a very good evening to all. My predecessors in this webinar has discussed in details many of the aspects of Cooch Behar heritage. My current presentation is only an outline of the heritage of Cooch Behar. The former princely state of Cooch Behar was founded in the early 16th century by Maharaja Vishwasingha of Cooch Behar dynasty. The state of Cooch Behar became a feudatory state of British India under the Bengal Presidency from 5th April 1772 and acceded to the Dominion of India on the 20th of August 1949. It was transformed into a district of West Bengal state from 1st January 1950. That's right, please. The state of Cooch Behar had 5 subdivisions, namely Cooch Behar, Dinhata, Mathabhanga, Tufanganj and Mekliganj. Here are the 5 subdivisions of the state. These subdivisions, which are now subdivisions of the present Cooch Behar district also, with the subdivisional towns of the same name. Slide 4, please. And the district headquarter, which has also a namesake, that is Cooch Behar, was once the former proud capital of the princely state. Slide 5, please. To begin with, let us have a look at the natural heritage of the district. We are privileged that I am privileged that my respected teacher, Dr. Abhay Prasad Das, has delivered a wonderful lecture on the biodiversity and natural heritage of the Duars. So I will try to complete this episode in brief. Now the natural heritage of Cooch Behar. Next slide, please. The Cooch Behar district is intersected by numerous rivers and streams. Many natural ditches and water bodies are found scattered throughout the district. The soil in Cooch Behar is of alluvial formation, therefore sandy and loose. Besides the northeastern portion of the district, where a black loam is found, which surpasses all other soils of the district in fertility. This is also the area from where the earth for making the idol of goddess Durga of the royal family is procured. Next, please. Once Cooch Behar comprised of a large area of forests, but mostly grasslands, as we can see from the photograph. Next forest, please. Here are the grasslands. Next, please. However, the district is well plain. Next, please. Cooch Behar exhibits occasional undulation towards the northeast. Here was once the most important forest land of Cooch Behar, the Garadhat reserves, which we can see on the top right of the slide. Next, please. The Garadhat reserves. The Garadhat reserves were the center of many historical big game and shoots during the state period and home to elephants, tigers, rhinoceros. Next, please. Water buffaloes, floricans, which are now almost Iraqi area. Grasslands or savannas, as we know, are being preserved in Europe and Africa as heritage. Such an initiative was also taken by the Royal Government of Cooch Behar in the 1940s, as it can be traced from the forest report compiled by a forest officer, Yusuf S. Ahmed. Thus, the state once abounded in forests, therefore timbers were easily available. Next, please. And there were also several artificial teak plantations, the saplings of which were procured from Burma. It is quite unfortunate that only 3% of the forest land is now left in the district. Next, please. Before moving on to the architectural, cultural, and social heritage of Cooch Behar, let us have a sneak peek on the archaeological heritage of the district. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you, Devajyoti. Of the archaeological sites and remains, the most old as well as important of all is Gosharimari, or ruins of the great Kamutapur fort. Next, please. The fort we are very sorry for the bad connectivity. It's taking time for the slides to appear on the screen. Devajyoti, could you please full screen? Yes, go on full screen. Thank you. The fort had a perimeter of 19 miles, making it the largest fort in the northeast. Next, please. According to the excavation report of 1998 to 2000 by the Archaeological Survey of India, based upon nature of structural and antiquarian remains and literary data, placed the period of these great ruins to be circa 910 plus minus 80, which is coeval with the Palasena period of Bengal. Next, please. The report also mentions that the main mound is not rich in pottery in comparison to other historical sites of Bengal. Next, please. Perhaps the absence of, you can see most of the images over here are also of stone, and very little utensils were discovered which are of earthen utensils at the ruins of the Gosharimari temple, except for this milch cow, which is of terracotta. Perhaps the absence of pottery appears to be justified because we have already seen the nature of the soil, which is sandy and with very little tensile strength. Next, please. Next are the ruins of the Chilarais fort at Andaran and Kamath Fulbari. These are heritage sites of Cooch Behar. These ruins are badly in need of an excavation, despite of it dating back to the 16th century. Next, please. And a few terracotta relics found in the site, no further information about its archaeological significance could be added. Next slide, please. Of the little-known sites, there are the temples and ruins at the Gobrachhara Bhitarkotik village complex. Next slide, please. Gobrachhara was once a seat of Sanskrit learning in Cooch Behar and the abode of Mustafid dynasty, the premier zamindars of Cooch Behar state. Next, please. There are also some archaeological remains at Baramaricha village and etc. All of these sites mentioned boasts of Masonic structures, which are relatively uncommon in this part of the country. We shall understand this issue further from the architectural heritage which Cooch Behar offers us. Next slide, please. If we have a look at the iconography prevalent in area, we can easily notice, with the aid of trifold classification presented by Nolinikanta Bhattashali, which was also followed by Nonigopal Majumdar, that in contrary to the background of images from Orissa and Satna, which are filled with a trefoil arc and nicely decorated halos behind the head respectively, these images are with oval-shaped halos, like we can see in case of this one. It is with the oval-shaped halo. And these oval-shaped halos are quite, they show semblance to those found in the medieval Bengal and Bihar. Next slide, please. So far for the stone images. These are some of the metal images, except for this one, the image on the right middle, which is earthen. These are some metal images. Next slide, please. All these idols were collected by a local museum in Cooch Behar during the state period. Next slide, please. Now let us divert our attention from archaeological heritage to the development of townships, where we shall also notice how the recently declared heritage town, that is Cooch Behar, was founded. Next slide, please. As we have already noticed that Cooch Behar district is intersected by numerous rivers and streams, the townships developed mostly by the riversides, including that of Goshanimari. There were once, as such, no compact villages in Cooch Behar, which was in contrary to the rest of Bengal. Townships which were established later on obviously had diverse reasons of formation. The healthiest of these were the subdivisional towns of Mekliganj and Dinhata. Next slide, please. This is an old map of Cooch Behar town during the reign of Maharaja Narendra Narayan. And we can see of this triangular shaped piece of land on the right hand side and lower side, and on the left hand side, Cooch Behar. This is the Cooch Behar town. It was on three sides enlapped by the river. The capital Cooch Behar was itself never as such healthy, neither it had a proper drainage system. But the question is why? Why was then such a location selected for the capital itself? For this answer, we may have a look at some of the observations made by Captain Thomas Herbert Lewin, the Deputy Commissioner of Cooch Behar in 1876. As we can see, the town of Cooch Behar was surrounded on three sides by two small streams, both called Torsha, which enlaps the town in their senior cities. According to Captain Lewin, the site of Cooch Behar town recalled the days when the dread of the Bhutias caused the position of a town to be chosen more with a view to defensive than to sanitary or commercial considerations. His observation appears to be quite justified. But we may add that not only Bhutan, but primarily such location was selected to protect the capital against Mughal invasions, the last of which occurred in the third decade of the 18th century, and it was only after this period that the Bhutanese incursions gained momentum in Cooch Behar. This theory is not necessarily applicable to the origin of all the towns in the district, but provides an example of how the capital of a princely state was founded, which went on to be the only planned town in the entire northeast. Even in the mid-19th century, the town was full of jungles and small dirty ditches and mudholes. The lowness of ground level also rendered it necessary for the inhabitants to construct artificial sites for their houses, and this was done by digging holes and utilizing the earth taken from them. And as a consequence, the town was filled with cesspools. After the British government assumed charge of administration in Cooch Behar on 1864, next slide please, it was decided that the only method of improving the state of things was to dig large tanks which will hold sufficient quantity of clean water and to fill up the holes with earth excavated. Thus originated many of the famous ponds of Cooch Behar town, and at least 76 of them were extant in the state period. Devajiti, could you just put on the slide number 31, please? This is an image of Sagar Digi. We all know that. But however, this Digi this pond had different reasons of origin. However, after the British administration took charge of Cooch Behar, it was decided that the only method of improving the state of things was to dig large tanks, which will hold sufficient quantity of clean water and to fill up the holes with earth excavated, thus originated these ponds. As I have already mentioned, that Cooch Behar town in the state period had 76 of them. Major Dalton once compared Cooch Behar with Venice, with all buildings and water, except for the roads which rendered the gondolas useless. As we can see the image of Sagadegi, which is an exception though, since it was excavated long before the British administration assumed charge. Next slide, please. But the roads of the town, as they stand today, also were founded at this period. The entire town was divided into blocks. A road was opened out through the block, as one or more tanks were dug, and the holes filled up. According to Mr. Metcalfe, this development was already achieved as early as in 1873. Next, please. And gradually, the bewitching avenues of Samania, Delvergia, Jacaranda, Roystonia, and others were also established. Next slide, please. The town proper, as it stood in the advent of 20th century, was planned and partially designed or built by Colonel John Colpoys Houghton, the first Deputy Commissioner of the state. Next slide, please. These are a few aspects of the heritage of Cooch Behar town for which we feel very proud today. This is an old avenue of Samania in Cooch Behar. Next slide, please. Let us now turn around to the architectural heritage. Next slide, please. The Cooch Behar capital displays of structures with Mughal architecture influences and Moorish elements. Next slide, please. Buildings with utilitarian style of architecture used by the early engineers of the East India Company. Next slide, please. The Bengal pinnacle or Ratna style with terracotta ornamentations. Next slide, please. Gothic architecture, the classical Greco-Roman, colonial with Norman fusion, Indo-Saracenic, the modified Art Deco or Indie Deco style. We can see the diversity of architectural styles used in the town of Cooch Behar. Next. And of course, the Italian style of architecture. The Italian style of architecture is quite common in Cooch Behar. There's a long-standing anomaly that the Cooch Behar Palace was built after the Buckingham Palace in England. But the Buckingham Palace is of the Greco-Roman style. Could we go back to 41, please? Just the previous one. As we can see the difference clearly from here, this is absolutely in the Italian style, while the Buckingham Palace, it is in the Greco-Roman style. Next, please. The first plan of Cooch Behar Palace which was laid out by Mr. Kane, assistant architect of Major Mount, was in the Indo-Saracenic or Moorish style. However, it was thought that a building on so elaborate a design involving a deal of stonework would be for a remote place like Cooch Behar, and would be unsuited for a remote place like Cooch Behar and unsuited to the surrounding also and the climate of the place. When Mr. E.J. Martin was assigned engineer to the palace, he rejected the earlier design, which was Indo-Saracenic, and prepared a new one of the Italian or classical style after the model of the elegant edifices in Venice, Florence, and Rome. Slide 43, please. As we can see from here, it is very interesting to note that the central metal dome of the palace, which took 4 months almost to set up, has semblance with the dome of St. Peter's Basilica at Italy. Next, please. As once Mr. Smith remarked that handsome public buildings would in time lead to handsome private buildings. Though the palace was not a public building, but the model of Cooch Behar Palace was mostly imitated by the people of Cooch Behar while designing their very own houses. Therefore, we have an preponderance of English pointed walls, exposed walls without plasters, and Corinthian pillars, etc. Can we go back to 41? Yes, thank you. We might have noticed that two Chinese pagodas on the second floor of the palace. There were at least two more in Cooch Behar, one at the town, which is still extant now. Can we go to slide 45? Yes, this one, please. Here is another pagoda. This still exists now. It was originally a temple. And there was another large one at the town of Dinhata, now demolished. Next slide, please. Before moving on to some of the private buildings, we can notice the beautifully and heavily decorated barrack styles also. Next, please. So much for the public buildings. Now we shall conclude this chapter taking example from two private buildings. This is the front view of the now demolished Mustafi Lodge, one of the largest private building complexes in the state. The house of Mustafis, also a center of culture, consisted of an orchid house, which was unparalleled in the entire Northeast, a large fern house, flower and fruit gardens, a small zoological garden of its own, two ponds, and a large tank for ornamental fishes. The edifice can be taken as a model for other private buildings in Cooch Behar, which the other buildings can be treated from the Mustafi Lodge downwards. Next, please. This was another masterpiece of Cooch Behar, the House of the Dattas, which showed beautiful colonial and fusion architecture. It's a pity that it's no more. Next, please. A previous one. It is to be mentioned that Cooch Behar not only engaged European architects and engineers, but also architects from different places of India and Chinese architects or engineers also. Next, please. The interiors of most of these private houses had European furnitures. Some of them were of also ivory and the ajadar from all over the world. We are to skip the effect of calamities which played a significant role in the development of architectural patterns in Cooch Behar. But just for note, Cooch Behar is an earth-prone area, very humid and frequented by floods. Next slide, please. Now we can have a look at the cultural heritage of the area. We can start with the local handicrafts. The inadequacy of the soil never encouraged the development of good pottery in this area, which is also evident from the remarks quoted on the report of excavation in Goshanimari. Next slide, please. Of all the early handicrafts found in this area, the most interesting are those produced from shola plant or Ascainomene aspera, which is a species of the Fabaceae family. We can see the depiction of different deities on handicrafts made from shola on the slide. Next comes a very old tradition, those crafted from bamboo. Cooch Behar is abundant in bamboo. Over 12 species of bamboo has been recorded by Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker in his Himalayan journal. Many useful household objects, including furnitures, are also produced from bamboo in this area. Next, please. Another old line handicrafts comes from the jute industry. We can see some objects made from jute on the right-hand side of the slide. Once an excellent jute fabric known as the mekli was quite popular in Cooch Behar, but the art is gradually dying out. The products seen on the right side of the screen are new manufactures. Next, please. Last but not the least is the pati or Sheetal pati. The pati plant or Scumanianthus dichotomus of the Maranthaceae family. This art, which is comparatively new in this area, was introduced by the migrants from East Bengal and for the past few decades gained an international popularity. The Sheetal pati or mats produced from the pati plant are most famous. Some of them even comprises of tasteful designs, as we can see on the slide. Here are some images from the Pati Museum in Dhaliabadi, Cooch Behar. Next, please. Amongst the other works which has a classical touch are the Bidri works. We can see the silver Bidri works on hookah on the left-hand side and the ivory dices on the right-hand side. Next, please. There are also stone carvings, tapestry with gold and silver embroidery. Next, please. And the impressive silver and gold filigree work. This is a container to keep the betel leaves, what we call pan in Bengali also, are also found among the relics of this area, but most of them were probably imported from outside. Next, please. There are references of trade being carried out from Kashmir to Tibet even in the middle of the 18th century, and in the northeastern part, Cooch Behar was an important center for trade. At that time, this commerce had a turnover of nearly 3.6 million rupees per annum. It is also interesting that not only Cooch Behar records of early Jesuit and English travelers in this area, but from the middle of the 18th century, French settlements can also be found. The Armenians were also among the established business classes in Cooch Behar. Amongst the Marwari classes, Marwaris from Jodhpur and Bikaner, and also bankers from South India used to carry over the business in this area, alongside with the Cooch Behari people and these Bengali traders. Burmese merchants also used to flock during the tobacco season and visit Cooch Behar with their flotilla. Thus, the sandy soil, which is so useless in making bricks and pottery, is an excellent medium for growing tobacco. In the European market, Adabari and Shalbari tobacco of Cooch Behar was once regarded as the best of quality from all over Asia. After all, Cooch Behar state was an agricultural province, and tobacco, jute, paddy and mustard were the main producers. This heritage of tobacco produce still forms a great part of the agriculture of Cooch Behar. Next slide, please. I would like to conclude my presentation by referring to an important intangible cultural heritage of Cooch Behar. Yesterday, one of our respected speaker, Dr. of Cooch Behar. Thus, we will omit about the Rash Mela, and we shall move on to one of the most richest heritage of Cooch Behar, that is its folk songs. Cooch Behar is well known for the Bhawaiya class of folk song and has given birth to eminent artists such as Surendra Kanto Rai Boshunia, Abbasuddin Ahmed, Keshav Chandra Barman, Biraja Prasanna Sengupta and others. In spite of Bhawaiya, there is Chatka and the Malshi. The Malshi type of folk song, it appears that it is perhaps now lost with time because it's not rarely heard. Next slide, please. But besides these folk songs, Cooch Behar had a cirque of classical music. Historical records confirm its existence in this area at least from the 16th century. But mostly the references can be found from the mid-19th century. At this time, the famous musicians such as Ramchandra Ghosh, Radha Govinda Goswami, Krishnadhan Bandyopadhyay, whom you can see on the slide, and later on Satish Chandra Mustafi, Rajendra Prasad Rai were performing at Cooch Behar. The continuation of this classical house in Cooch Behar is now almost lost. Krishnadhan Bandyopadhyay was the first person to introduce staff notation in Indian music, and his magnum opus, the book Gita Sutra Sar, as seen on the slide. Next, please. This is the Gita Sutra Sar, and we can see the Indian or Hindustani music, which has been transformed into staff notation on the right-hand side of the slide. This book was written by Krishnadhan Bandyopadhyay, and it was composed in Cooch Behar. It was one of the most famous books where the Hindustani music was represented in European staff notation. Next, please. Previous one, please. Krishnadhan was from Behala, Kolkata. He was a student of Kshetramohan Goswami, the renowned music teacher of Tagore family, and also a student of Haraprasad Bandyopadhyay. It was Krishnadhan who introduced the musical tradition of Vishnupur Gharana or Vishnupur house in Cooch Behar. the legendary musician Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, who was a Marathi and a learned Bengal. Hello. The legendary musician Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, who was a Marathi Pandit, he learned Bengali only to read this book, the Gita Sutrasar, and introduced Gita Sutrasar as a textbook at the Morris Musical College at Lucknow. Thus, a person from South Bengal learned music of the Vishnupur Gharana, which in turn came from the Western India and introduced it in the far northeast. His composition, which had European notations, was introduced by another person who was Marathi, from Western India into Lucknow. And whenever people will read the book Gita Sutrasar, they will read the name of Cooch Behar. This shows how our cultural heritage can cut asunder the bonds of caste, creed, and ethnicity, and rise above all limitations and declare the heritage of human civilization as global. Next, please. In conclusion, I would like to quote from a speech delivered by Maharaja Jitendra Narayan of Cooch Behar in 1921 to the students of Victoria College, just 3 years after the termination of the Second World War. The speech: do you realize that in these days of cosmopolitanism, a nation who tries to keep entirely within itself and refuses to absorb the ideas that at every moment of its life flooding over the barriers is bound to be isolated and metaphorically starved out of existence? Do you realize that in the rapid march of events in the last few years, the whole world is tending to become one country and nationalism developing into the nationalism of the world? Our present pandemic situation has again given us the opportunity to rethink and reconsider the extracts of this speech. Next slide, please. These are our curses. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul, for your wonderful speech. I think the photograph that you of Gobra Chora that you have shown is probably when we all together visited the place, isn't it so?
No, it was taken earlier. We visited the place in 2016. I think it was taken in 2014 or 15. But we have the photographs also during our visit too.
Okay, but okay. So, do we have any questions? Well,
Questions are most
I
invited.
can see here Sohag Bhattacharjee has written a very good presentation. Thank you so much for this beautiful opportunity to learn so much. Tulakshana Lama said, very satisfactory presentation. Thank you. Alokesh Kumar Sarkar said, thanks a lot, sir, for such a beautiful presentation with so much portraits and illustration. Shubham Burman said, many thanks to this excellent presentation. Really enjoyed and learned a lot from all 3 days conversations. It was beautiful and thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Okay, Debarun Chakraborty has written, how can local history be taught to the students of the new generation as they are not taught in books? That's a question maybe you can answer, Mr. Paul.
Shubham, can you please repeat the question? Hello, Shubham, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, Devarun Chakraborty has written that how can local history be taught to the students of the new generation as they are not taught in books, in school syllabus, actually?
It's a very nice question. First of all, local history. When we we should understand that what is local history. And the history that we read in our school books, what is the necessity of reading that history? That is, the history comprises of several elements. Some of them are important and some of them are not. And yet, some of them have never been highlighted at all. Even the important events, they're neglected because someone never studied them, or perhaps someone never felt an interest on them. If we have to introduce local history in schools, and as far as local history is also a subject in the primary schools, as far as I'm concerned, that at least I know a school that is the Sarada, where the local history of Cooch Behar is being taught. And we need to introduce at least a textbook on local history from the primary sections, and it also depends upon our interest to study. It is far better to study books than to travel a mile, as a wise man have remarked. The local history, we are living within it. And if all of the presentations that have been exhibited on the slide, they're from our city and our district. We pass in front of them, notice the structures and the history. And secondly, we have very little interest on these things. The case of, we cannot reject this second issue because it's also a factor. So primarily it depends that, are we interested ourselves? That is the main thing to do. That is, grow your own interest. And then, when we have grown our own interest, then we can try to teach others also that what we have learned, not actually teach is a harsh word. We can share our knowledge with others. But of course, an initiative in the government level is always necessary. As far as I can recall, during the state reign, as I've studied, I was not there at that time, local history was taught in the schools in Cooch Behar. And later on also, there was also a textbook of history on local history in the schools of Cooch Behar. But this has not been done in a very large scale. These are sporadical initiatives and sporadical efforts. So if the government will think about it, that to introduce local history in the syllabus, then we can study about it. But the primary thing is our interest. We must never neglect that. Thank you. Hope I have answered your question properly, Devarun. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Devarun Chakraborty has, yeah, you are audible. Devarun Chakraborty has written, thank you, sir. Good wishes for Cooch Behar Archive. So,
Thank you very much.
yeah, I think yeah, right. So I think in today's age, there are lots of other sources of history, knowing history, like mass media, different kinds of platforms like YouTube and other different bloggers. So different theories and alternate theories are also being built up. So this is also a way to learn, I think, apart from your
Exactly, Shubham.
conventional
It is
school
so.
books.
But unfortunately, that most of the information which are put on the internet.
So
Yes, please. Yes, please continue, Shubham.
yeah, no, no, go ahead, go ahead.
The information which are often put on the internet, they are sometimes they're quite erroneous. So we must keep a notice of the books we are reading, because history is not history is not reading history is not reading storybooks. It's quite different, because history and archaeology, these are the search for the fact that has actually occurred, and no one knows the end of history, because these facts keeps on changing with new discoveries. It's quite similar to that of science also. I think there are no further questions, Shubhams. Anyone from our
So, uh,
esteemed participants, please?
uh, well, there is another question.
Yes, please.
Let me read it out. Okay, so Orko Acharji has asked, what is the basic reason behind the impact of Islamic architectural traits on Cooch architecture, as because from its initial period, rebuilding of Kamakhya temple, Cooch architecture largely influenced by Moorish elements.
That's a very nice question.
Can you shed
Thank
some
you,
light on it?
Mr. Acharji. Pardon? Am I audible? Hello, am
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
audible?
Yeah, you are
Yeah.
audible. Yeah.
First of all, when Dr. Buchanan Hamilton visited this area in 1808, he noticed that the ancient ruins, or the old ruins, they were not only actually of the ancient times, the ruins of the Kamutapur fort, it consisted of corbels. The use of corbels was quite a natural feature in the Indian architecture. There are very few structures in India which consist of a true arc. And after this period, there's a lacuna. There are Masonic buildings as well as stone buildings are almost absent in this area. But later on, during the advent of the Sultanate and Mughal period, Cooch Behar was under the Mughal and Sultanate rule for a long time. And this also ensured the development of Islamic art in this area. Secondly, the Maharajas of Cooch Behar, including Maharaja Lakshmi Narayan, whose rule began in the 1587 at that period. At that period, if I'm not wrong, Emperor Akbar and Jahangir were at this throne of Delhi. At this time, Maharaja Lakshmi Narayan also brought engineers from Delhi to build the temples in Cooch Behar. It has been mentioned in the Rajapakan that Maharaja Lakshmi Narayan brought engineers from Delhi to build the temple of Jalpesh at Jalpaiguri. However, the temple of Jalpesh does not necessarily represent the Islamic architecture, but there is also a fusion architecture in it. Perhaps the reason of it is that it suffered severe damage in the great earthquake of 1897, which measured 8.7 in Richter scale. And these are the few reasons perhaps for which the Islamic architecture has influence in all over the buildings and even the temples in Cooch Behar. Hope I have answered your question well, Mr. Acharji. I shall be pleasured if you have any further questions, please.
So I think we will take another question. This will be the last question.
Yes, please.
So Pragya, I think it's Professor Pragya Paramita, ma'am.
Yes,
She
please.
asked the architectures with foreign influences that
Yes.
you have shown, where the architects came from those particular country to the Cooch Behar, or the local architects local architects used to construct those.
It's a very interesting question also. The architects were at Cooch Behar and they designed the buildings. They were Europeans, they were also from India, different parts of India, and also local architects who resided in Cooch Behar. As far as I can recall, one of the most famous designers of buildings in Cooch Behar at that time, during this early periods of the state reign in the late 19th century, the state engineers were actually overseers. They were not engineers, they were overseers. Most of the structures built during that period were designed by Govinda Chandra Rai. He was a local of Cooch Behar. Afterwards, eligible overseers we have seen like Kedarnath Majumdar, he was an engineer, he was a famous engineer. He was also responsible for designing this washroom at the palace. And besides Mr. Barclay, Mr. E.J. Martin, Mr. Kane, and Mr. They were the architects and engineers of the palace, and also some commercial firms such as Messrs. Rilliard and Edwards. They were also operating in Cooch Behar. And there was also Mr. Shatyendranath Moitro and Hemchandra Bosu, Satish Chandra Guha. They were the overseers and engineers of Cooch Behar. So we can see if you would study that how these local architects, they considered or they looked upon the colonial style. Most of us had seen the head post office of Cooch Behar. It consists of colonial style of architecture and, if I'm not wrong, Corinthian pillars in both of its facade and both of its floors on its facade. Now, if a foreign architect, this point was noted out, this is a very interesting point, this point was noted out by Dr. Arjun Mukherjee. If a foreign architect had designed that building, that post office building, he would have used the Corinthian pillars on the ground floor and Doric, Ionic or Iboric on the first floor. But we can see that Corinthian pillars has been used in both of the floors, that is on the ground and on the first floor. This hints about the improvisation of colonial architecture by the local architects. And this has given rise to sort of fusion architecture, we can call that. We can also find that in Kolkata also. So this is how the developed architectural patterns developed in Cooch Behar. I hope that I have answered your question well. If there is any further queries, please ask.
Yeah, this is. I'm sorry. The question was from Progya Tarafdar, a student of history. Okay. One last question. This is from Pradeep Jha. He has asked, what kind of architectural pattern is seen in the ancient Goshanimari temple?
Thank you, Mr. Jha. First of all, the Goshanimari temple is not of the ancient times. It was constructed in 1665. And secondly, it has Mughal influences. If we can see the gate, which has a sort of foliar arc, and the home ghar and the main temple, they are of different period. But when we see the Nat Mancha, which is in front of the main temple, it was constructed afterwards. This point was also noted by Mr. Vad, the superintending archaeologist who visited Cooch Behar in 1951. And it's quite interesting that the home ghar, which we call the place for where the sacrificial fire is kindled, and the main sanctum sanctorum, where the deity of the goddess is kept, they have predominant Mughal influences, and they have also Moorish elements. So we can treat them as Mughal influenced or Moorish architectures. They're not typically Indo-Saracenic, but we can refer to them as pre-Indo-Saracenic. There is sort of a phase of transition. But if we can notice the roof of the temple, it also exhibits the influence of Bengal Chala style, despite of the dome, of course. The domes are quite different in Cooch Behar. Once a researcher from Cooch Behar asked that why all of the temples in Cooch Behar had such a similar dome. And he received the answer that perhaps it is due to the heavy rains in Cooch Behar. We can notice a similar type of domes in the temple of Baneshwar, as well as Goshanimari and Siddheswari also. So, first of all, that the temple of Goshanimari shows Mughal style and has Moorish influences also. Secondly, the temple complex, the front building of the temple complex, which is the Nat Mandir, it was constructed afterwards, that is after the main temple was constructed. And if you also see the outer fortifications of walls, They were also reconstructed after the great earthquake of 1897 because the temple was severely damaged in that earthquake. And if you will go to Goshani Mari, we can still see that the main temple is a little bit inclined. That is the effect of the great earthquake of 1897. Thank you, Mr. Jha. I hope that I have been able to answer your question. So, thank you, Shubham. Thank you. Shubham, are you there?
So I think Mr. Paul.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think one word, short answer will be sufficient to this question. Last question we are taking from Alokesh Kumar Sarkar. Is it true that some portions of Cooch Behar Rajbari is in underground due to earthquake? A short answer would be sufficient, I think.
No, this concept is not correct. But yes, Cooch Behar Palace has a basement, but some portions of the palace are not under the earth of the Cooch Behar Palace. Thank you. So thank you, Shubham. I think that we are over with our question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Paul, for your wonderful talk. So
thank you, but
yeah,
I would like to acknowledge
wishes from the audiences.
Thank you. I would like to acknowledge our most honorable advisors. I would like to acknowledge our most honorable advisors and members of the organizing committee of the this international webinar. I have been privileged and honored to be the direct tutelage and guidance as a student of respected Dr. Dipayan Chattopadhyay, Dr. Shoikat Nashkor, Dr. Rahul Kumar Dotto, and Dr. Shamiran Ghosh while I was a student of biological sciences. I am indebted to them, and I must also offer my respect and thanks to all of our respected advisors and members for their kind guidance, which has in a way quite indulged us to go forward with this webinar. My sincere thanks to all. I shall request Shubham Sarkar, Assistant Secretary of Cooch Behar Archive, who has worked hand to hand, day and night with our team archive to make this webinar successful. Shubham, please deliver our vote of thanks. Namaskar, Pranam.
We are receiving loads of good wishes for our organization. Now, obviously, I cannot read them all due to the shortage of time. And so thanks to all of you for your good wishes, because your wishes are the fuels for us to move ahead in the future. And for the past 3 days, we have been witnessing the international webinar on the global heritage movement and Cooch Behar. Perhaps, if not the first of its own kind organized from Cooch Behar, this webinar stands apart because of its unconventional nature, which included the reminiscence session, rendering the webinar unique. I, on behalf of the organization, thank you all, the respected speakers, Ms. Shanghamitra Basu, PhD, Coordinator, National Scientific Committee, Historic Towns and Villages, ICOMOS, India, Ms. Julia Booth, Lecturer, University of Sydney, Her Highness Maharani Uttara Devi Sahiba of Kota, Sri Kamal Banerjee, formerly Head of MIS and Internal Audit Hindustan National Glass and Industries Limited, Dr. Esther Schmidt, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Historic Houses, O.P. Jindal Global University, India, Ms. Aisha Sara Kovi, Teacher of Prep School, London, United Kingdom, Sri Tapan Bhattacharya, former Deputy Superintending Archaeological Engineer, Archaeological Survey of India, Dr. Arjun Mukherjee, Assistant Professor, Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, Dr. Abhay Prasad Das, former Professor, Department of Botany, University of North Bengal, Sri Alok Tripathi, Additional Director General, Archaeological Survey of India, Kumar Srimant Himmat Bahadur Jitendra Singh Ji Gaikwad, Baroda, Rajmata Udaya Devi Sahiba of Payapur, Shree Rzishikalpa Paul, founder president of Cooch Behar Archive. I also thank our advisors, Professor Dr. Chittobroto Palit, former professor, Department of History, Jadavpur University, Kolkata; Dr. Pannalal Goswami, former professor, Department of Chemistry, Cotton College, Guwahati; Dr. Sudeshna Banerjee, associate professor, Department of History, Jadavpur University, Kolkata; Sri Shankar Kumar Bose, managing trustee, Institute of Northeast India Studies, Kolkata; Dr. Nipendranath Pal, senior researcher and eminent writer on Cooch Behar history, Cooch Behar; Dr. Suchandra Bodhon, professor, Department of Architecture, joint coordinator, Center for Human Settlement Planning, Jadavpur University, Kolkata; Dr. Anando Gopal Ghosh, former professor, Department of History, North Bengal University; Dr. Dipayan Chattopadhyay, associate professor, Department of Botany, Bethune College, Kolkata; Dr. Vinita Paul Gardner, eminent writer and art critic, Delhi. I would also like to thank our respected members, Professor Nipendro Loshkar, Professor of Agriculture Entomology, Uttarbango Krishi Vishwavidyalaya; Dr. Rahul Kumar Datto, Associate Professor and Head of the Department, Department of Zoology, Jhargram Raj College, Jhargram; Dr. Nandini Jana, Associate Professor, Department of History, Durgapur Government College, Durgapur; Dr. Shongita Ghosh, Assistant Professor, Department of Bengali, Lady Brabourne College, Kolkata; Professor Anil Kumar Sarkar, Professor, Department of History, University of Kalyani; Dr. Debashish Mullik, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of PG Department of Bengali, Acharya Brajendranath Shil College, Cooch Behar; Dr. Somiran Ghosh, Associate Professor, Department of Zoology, Bethune College, Kolkata; Sri Orko Acharya, Assistant Professor, PG Department of History, Acharya Brajendranath Shil College, Cooch Behar; Dr. Alok Saha, Associate Professor and Head of the Department, Department of Bengali, Tura Government College, Meghalaya; Dr. Pragya Paramita Sarkar, Associate Professor, PG Department of History, Acharya Brajendranath Shil College, Cooch Behar; Dr. Shoikat Noshkar, Assistant Professor, Department of Botany, the University of Burdwan, Sri Vikram Chatterjee, Lecturer in Physics, West Bengal Survey Institute, Bandel Department of Technical Education, Training and Skill Development, for their kind cooperation, suggestion, and support, which have given us the inspiration for future to continue our journey with such enriching events. A special thanks to our tech support team, Sri Devarun Chakraborty, Sri Devajyoti Chakraborty, Sri Kushal Chakraborty, and Sri Avrodev, whose relentless efforts have made it possible by this far. We also deeply apologize for the technical difficulties you had to face, and we ensure to address these issues in our future programs for a seamless experience. Stay safe. Now, I would request Mr. Rzishikalpa Paul to mark the end. Mr. Paul, are you there?
Hello. Hello, Shubham. Can you hear me?
I would like you to. I would ask you to mark the end of our program.
Okay. Thank you, Shubham. It will be a pleasure. So we
There's a lag between.
we declare the end of our session. Thanks for being with us. Stay safe. Take care. Thank you. Namaskar.